if you want my everlasting beef or my everlasting 15-year-old, problem or issue that sometimes people don't talk about, is that folks that didn't fundamentally understand the business of dentistry, really got involved in dentistry, whether it was in an advisory capacity, an investing capacity, or an operational capacity. And we're still working right now to clean it all up.
I am so excited for today's episode. We've got a titan in the dental industry, but before we go there, we've got to go to the Ask Ken segment. The question that came in was, what's the best way for a DSO leader to forecast collections when they have multiple practices with inconsistent performance? Oh, this is a painful place to be. Obviously, the ideal thing here would be to convert everything to accrual so everything would be more consistent. But to the degree you're not able to do that yet and make that change, the best thing to do here is to focus on looking at each one of the practices independently from each other, because that's what's happening right now anyway. And you want to forecast for each of those individual practices. And my preference here always is to look at doctor days, look at the time that the doctor is going to be there in the practice, understand the modalities that they generally lean toward when they're working with patients. And then what that will do is that will give you a decent forecast over the next couple of months for each of those practices, and should help you rein in some of the cash flow challenges and concerns that you have about moving forward in the business. Also, there's sometimes seasonality that comes in, so you want to look and see that, because some months have more recare coming in and those sorts of things. So definitely you want to go with that. All right, now we've covered that. I'm super excited to introduce our guest today. This is Brian Colao. He's been in this industry forever. Brian, I was thinking about it. I actually think I attended the very first DICOMA meeting way back there in downtown Dallas, way back in the day. So I've appreciated the relationship with you over the years, and everything you've done in dentistry. Why don't you take just a quick minute, introduce yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Well, Ken, this is year 30 for me. We were talking about that offline before. So I'm trying not to feel old. I'm trying just to power through and, do what I've always done and educate and provide as much information as I can. But whenever we get into these intros, it causes me to think about these things. And this is year 30 for me. I think I've advised, we were added this up to over 750 DSOs, all 50 states, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, Australia. And it's been a great run. And like they're giving me these dental influencer awards. We were joking about all that stuff. So I've enjoyed the 30 years, but it is a little depressing sometimes when you think about those things.
Well, I agree. I'm right there behind you, probably not too far. So I'm feeling that. I'm feeling it too. So the focus here of the podcast is the Dental Truth Project, and our guests are talking about things that they want to see change, the things that aren't being talked about, things that are maybe swept under the rug, things that are perhaps hurting the industry's capability to move forward and to grow and to expand. So love for you to pick one or two or a couple of those that are near and dear to your heart, and we can chat about it.
Yeah, there's really one for me. I could talk for 3 hours about it, even though it's one, but it's really one that on many, many facets, has bothered me for a long time. Like I said, I've been doing this 30 years. It probably didn't bother me the first 15 years, and then this phenomenon came up. And the phenomenon that came up somewhere around 2010 was this idea that we can profit off the dental industry, build dental organizations, sell dental organizations, advise people in the dental industry without fundamentally understanding the business of dentistry. That's the thing that has most troubled me. And you can, like I said, I could talk for an hour. You could pinpoint facets of it, like, one, certain folks that, bought dental organizations with cheap money, not understanding the business of dentistry and have paid the price. We could spend a lot of time talking about that and some of those situations that, often with new management, the original management that did that stuff is not there anymore for, probably obvious reasons. And now, we're working with lenders or receivers or working with new management to kind of clean up, a lot of those situations. It goes for advisors too. And I know this, Ken, because you've written a book, did some things. You're an advisor that's been in the industry for a long time. But how many times have you seen advisors that just heard that dentistry was a lucrative business have been around like 15 minutes and showed up now and are, all over the internet, all over social media, and are really self-proclaimed experts and are running around. And this is serious. I've taken this very, very serious. I mean, I know you have, it's obvious, but this is people's business. Okay. Whether it's a solo practitioner, whether it's a group practitioner, whether it's a small DSO, a giant DSO, there is either an individual owner's money and livelihood at stake, several maybe partners if it's a group practice, or private equity or outside investors and institutional investors and people whose money that is, that made up the private equity fund, whose money is at stake. And this is not some sort of like bluff your way through thing. And it just really disappoints me. It has for a while, not new for about, but it just, I would say this. A lot of folks got by that really had no business advising people, but they got by when the times were great, when money was cheap and the M&A market was explosive. You could mask a lot of a lot of defects and a lot of issues and a lot of problems could be hidden behind the fact that there was just like, what did Greenspan say? Irrational exuberance was his phrase one time for the stock market, or just a unsatiable appetite for M&A and dentistry. When everybody wants to buy everything, no matter what, and that's where we were from about 2015 through the end of 2021. What I always said is the normal rules of business didn't apply. Like, for example, if you open up a Burger King franchise or a McDonald's franchise or whatever, and you're a terrible operator, you're absolutely terrible. What usually happens is you lose all your money, and that's it. Like, it cost you $1 million or $500,000 or whatever it was to open up this franchise, and you stunk and you lost all your money. And the bank probably took, whatever it was, got sold out, and you just lost your money. Maybe you have to file bankruptcy too, and you're in a terrible situation. In dentistry for so long, if you were a terrible operator or a mediocre operator, you could make a little bit of money, maybe not make a ton of money, but still make a little bit of money, or worst case, somebody would buy it from you. You kind of get your money back, or even make a tiny bit of money on the deal, and you'd move on. And all you lost was the opportunity cost of, a couple years of doing this, but you were financially relatively break even or unscathed. And all that kind of changed in June of 2022 when the interest rates skyrocketed to levels not seen for decades. I mean, again, if you're old like me, you've seen it before. But for most people in the industry, a lot of the young folks, or even people 30s, 40s, they hadn't seen this. In the history of the DSO industry, they'd never seen interest rates that high. And all of a sudden, the weaknesses that were maybe hiding behind exuberance now got exposed.
That's right.
And it happened all across the board. It happened to the poor organizations. I mean, it happened. The organizations struggled. The investors struggled because maybe they weren't going to get the returns they hoped for, or the timeline was going to be a lot worse. And then a lot of individual folks struggled because the so-called advisors that looked like they knew what they were doing back when, you probably could have got a pineapple in here and a pineapple could have sold the dental office. Or if you had a German Shepherd, your German Shepherd could have showed up here and helped you sell a dental office. Now, when you really had to understand the business, it became really, really messy, and a lot of people got advice that they thought was sound, and it turned out to be, the wrong advice. So, that's a long-winded way, but I would, if you want my everlasting beef or my everlasting 15-year-old problem or issue that sometimes people don't talk about, is that folks that didn't fundamentally understand the business of dentistry really got involved in dentistry, whether it was in an advisory capacity, an investing capacity, or an operational capacity. And we're still working right now to clean it all up.
Yeah, so many truth bombs that you've shared there. I'm interested to ask a couple of questions here, Brian. One of them is, as you were talking about all these outsiders trying to become insiders in the business, one of the biggest challenges that I found is if they did not have healthcare provider background, that's where things would get really wonky. And I can give you one quick example, and then I'm sure you have many more. But when you bring in an outsider, private equity firm or an outside advisor, and they can't understand why revenue goes down a little bit around Christmas time, because doctors need to have Christmas, right? And they're not machines. They're not
And why
software
it
that
goes up
just
at
keeps
spring
going,
break or
right?
something like that. Spring
Yeah.
break, it looks like you're the most profitable business ever, and then it goes down at Christmas time.
Yeah. And so I'm interested. I mean, that's one place where I see that those without provider based background coming in and trying to run dental practices is sometimes very challenging. And sometimes, from my perspective, even private equity coming in sometimes just never really gets fully educated about the business model and about, and that's one like small little silly thing that at Christmas time revenue can go up and down based on days open and, those kind of things. But yeah, curious for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, you know what? I want to be clear, by the way. A lot of private equity groups didn't know very much about dentistry and did very well. Okay, even in the market because they took their time to research. They got proper advisors that knew what they were doing and they got good advice and they made sound, thoughtful decisions. So, if anybody's listening to this, I don't want to suggest like if you're not an expert on dentistry, you can never show up here and make a profitable investment. You absolutely can. The issue that got me, so concerned were people not doing their homework, not understanding it, and just kind of jumping in. I mean, I've advised a lot of PE groups and a lot of investors that knew very little about dentistry, and I don't want to brag, but certainly calling me was probably good because I could, help them myself, plus get them in touch with all the really good advice, maybe if they needed, specific accounting or they needed, other type of operational advice, I knew who to call, and I felt like we did very well for a lot of organizations where the original investors didn't know like anything about dentistry, but heard it was a recession proof type business and wanted to get involved. But there were a lot of folks that they didn't know anything either, and this is where I'll go back to the advisors. They got maybe bad advisors, and maybe it wasn't their fault because you go see somebody that's got a marketing machine. They're all over LinkedIn, they're all over social media. It's all about how great they are, and when you really drill down, and a lot of people don't, you have to find a few dinosaurs like me, and I'm not the only one. There's a few of us out there to find a few of us dinosaurs that are like, hey, have you heard of this person? Not before like 18 months ago or something like that. A lot of these folks either gave bad advice or reckless advice, or folks didn't seek out the right people. But, to your point, it's on a couple levels, right? If you have provider experience, then you can understand what the life of a provider is. Even if you've gotten out of chair side and you've graduated business, at least you understand the cyclical nature and what goes on in a dental practice. But the other danger of not having any provider experience is you don't know how to get along with providers. And that's been another big problem that has plagued the industry for decades. I mean, the people that do it well make a killing. The people that don't do it well struggle. I mean, it's not like a brand new problem that just showed up. But I said, you were talking about the very first DICOMA conference. I know you were at the second. I don't know. There weren't that many people at the first one, but we don't got to talk about that. But something that I've been saying since the the very first conference, and certainly any one you attended, whether it was number 2 or number 1, is you got to get along with your affiliated dentist. If you can't get along with what I used to say, it's gotten a little more complicated, but I said, you got to get along with your affiliated dentist. You got to put patients in the seats and you got to follow the regulations. There's more nuances to that. You got to leverage technology now. You got to do some other things, but still 3 of the fundamental pillars, like we've not eliminated those pillars. We've added a few, but we've not eliminated the fundamental pillar that you got to get along with your affiliated dentist. And I guess if you've never been in the industry and you're not being advised by people in the industry and you're not really well versed, there's been a lot of struggles where people have had misunderstandings about the dual nature of the DSO. You buy a just about any other business outside of healthcare out there. You buy a Burger King franchise, like we talked about earlier. Yeah, you can boss everybody around. You own the business now. You can fire people. You can boss them around. If you get up on the wrong side of the bed, you can. I mean, maybe not a good idea, but you could fire somebody for that. Whatever you feel like you want to do, it's your business right now. You can cut expenses. You can tell them what they have to do, what they can't do, things like that. In dentistry, can't, except for 4 states, which don't really apply to most of the United States, only licensed dentists can own dental practices, and you can't interfere with their independent professional judgment, and you can't, order them around or tell them specifically on clinical matters what they can do or what they can't do. And there have been so many misunderstandings in the industry where people, quote, bought the business. What they really did is they bought the DSO and they inherited all of the suite of contractual obligations obligations, and they definitely have the right going forward to provide non-clinical support services, charge their management fee, and that does allow them to take a lot of the profits. That's true. But what they don't have is the right to interfere with the independent professional judgment of the licensed dentist that owns the practice, or dictate quotas or procedures or what they can do. They can certainly make certain non-binding recommendations to the extent, they make sense, but they can't just act with unfettered discretion like a typical owner of a business. And there were a lot of misunderstandings. So yeah, I mean, if you don't have a provider background, and by the way, you don't have to be a dentist, you just have to have a background of working with providers and understanding it is. You could have been even an office manager for 20 years and you've never had a dental license, but you got some idea about how a dental practice operates. You have an idea of how to get along with dentists and not get along with dentists. That would even work. But a lot of folks didn't have that background. And as you pointed out, they really struggled to, one, understand just the fundamental of business. When does it go up? When does it go down? How do we manage cash? And then they also struggled mightily to get along with the dentists that are the lifeblood of the business. I mean, if you don't have associates and owner dentists doing their job, you don't have a business. Until AI lets us invent robots that actually can go out and practice dentistry, and maybe that'll happen, probably not my lifetime, but maybe that's not that far away. Until such a thing happens, you gotta have associate dentists and owner dentists and people practicing dentistry. And if you can't get along with them and they're not willing to, be on board and practice dentistry and do things, you're going to struggle. I mean, you're going to struggle really badly.
That's right. And I think there's an interesting sort of way that the power in these bottlenecks can work themselves through. But I was on a podcast just recently and they asked me, what advice would I give to somebody who's coming out of school and wants to be an associate? And I said, you need to walk in like you have all the power, because they need you, and they need you desperately to be there, because they can't do what you do, which is dentistry.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's certainly good. I mean, I'm sure all the DSOs didn't appreciate that, but that advice you gave there. But certainly from a business standpoint, there are a shortage of associates, and they without question, have a lot more power than they ever had in the history of the industry. But I would say something different. Not that what you said was wrong. I mean, look, that's the economics 101, supply and demand. If you're in short supply, you can come in and demand more. So I don't disagree with you, but what I would say, maybe in addition to that, is same thing applies to you. Understand the business of dentistry. You're coming out at a disadvantage because dental school don't teach you that. Now, I'm teaching at a few dental schools lately, and I am teaching the business of dentistry. Everybody knows I'm not teaching anybody how to drill or fill cavities or anything, but why do they let me on the campus to show up there? Because I have knowledge about the business of dentistry, and I'm teaching that. And a fun exercise I always make on day one is raise your hand if they taught you anything in the last 3 years about how to negotiate with a landlord. Like nothing. Raise your hand if they told you how to order supplies and equipment and how to negotiate good prices. Like nothing. Raise your hand if they told you how to hire employees, fire employees, supervise employees without violating the labor regulations. Like nobody raises their hand. The list goes on of things that I point out, but they don't. So, if you're going to be an associate, certainly, let's responsibly use whatever bargaining power you have, because you'll be more credible. If you just walk in and you say, well, look, there's a shortage of us and I'm in demand, so just pay me money, and I don't care if I know anything or don't know anything, just pay me money. Well, you might get more money. You might, but you're going to create a lot of resentment and a lot of problems, and people may not, like you, and, you may struggle, personally in your career. But if you walk in and you're like, look, I know everything. I've spent time. I've done my homework. I understand the economics of a dental practice. And yes, I am not going to settle for less than my worth. I want you to pay me, what market is, but I'm going to be a real viable member of this office. I understand how this works. I'm not going to be some clueless person that shows up, some like little baby you got to feed bottles to for the first, couple years here. I'm going to be somebody that, maybe there's a slight ramp up, but I'm going to, I understand how this all operates here, and I'm gonna try to just slot right into this thing and help this well-oiled machine work. I mean, if you're like that, you're gonna have a great career, if that's the way you are. So that that would be the same rules for the associate. Educate yourself on the business of dentistry. Don't just walk in like you got no clue about anything, but you're entitled to a bunch of money.
All right, one last question here as we get towards wrapping up the episode. The value of having a culture, a real tangible culture in a DSO, as opposed to saying, hey, I don't really believe in all that stuff, and it's just a bunch of kumbaya around the fireplace. Could you maybe talk about what you see in the industry right now about organizations that are investing and trying to build culture as opposed to those that aren't?
Yeah, look, it's not new, but it's critical now. Okay, when everybody was printing money, 10 years ago, I suppose you could skate by without any type of culture, because it is true. I mean, you don't like to admit this, but you got the truth show here, so we talk about the truth. When you're printing money and stuff, you'll overlook a lot. You will. You'll put up with a lot. A lot of stuff that you wish. It's kind of like a winning football team. Ken, I love the NFL. You know that. If the kicker stinks and is missing field goals all the time, but you're like the Chiefs, and you're putting, well, maybe not this year, but the Chiefs of other years, and you're putting up 50 points every single week, you're like, if the kicker misses a few field goals, we're not going to waste our time on this. But when it's like a nail biter and the margin is almost nothing between you and other teams, you better be able to kick those field goals, or you're going to lose games. And it's the same thing with culture. And right now the margins are, you would always want, just like the NFL, you always want a good kicker. You never don't want a good kicker, but you can skate by with it when times are just great. And it's the same thing in dentistry. You could skate by with no definable culture, or even like maybe even a slightly negative culture, if you're just making so much money. People will just look past it. But when the margins go down and you've got to find every possible advantage to differentiate yourself or succeed, and as you pointed out with the associates, the labor market is tight for dentists, for hygienists, for dental assistants, for non-licensed, non-clinical staff that works there. Everything's tight. Then the way you differentiate yourself, and the way you stop high turnover, and the way you stop hemorrhaging staff, is by having a culture. It's not hocus pocus. It's never been. But again, dentistry's been a victim of its own prosperity. It did so well all those years that you could look past some of the stuff. But now that dentistry, is some of the same market conditions that are affecting everybody else are starting to affect dentistry, culture is your equalizer, your way of saying, even though maybe I'm not breaking the bank on these employees, they're going to stay here because they like the culture. These dentists will do a couple extra procedures a week. The patient comes in emergency. Dentist could leave at 5 o'clock, but he's going to stay till 7 p.m. because we need him and he likes working here and it's the right thing to do. We need somebody to cover and answer the phone. Somebody called in sick. This person, it's their day off, but they're going to come in because they love being a part of this team and they want to cover for this team. I mean, all of those things occur if you have great culture. And if you don't have great culture, the opposite happens. The dentist doesn't stay late, doesn't, leaves, runs out the door the first possible time. Nobody covers for anybody else. You lose people all the time. This guy across the street's paying an extra $5. Okay, they're gone. They're out the front door. When you've got a great culture, the person across the street's paying $10,000 more, and they're like, nope, not going to leave. I'm not leaving here for $10,000. I love this culture. So, I think just that's a basically a long-winded way to answer your question, that culture is critical, always has been, but now more than ever is crucial to the success of an organization in these sort of this unnatural state, Ken, that we find ourselves in. Cost of labor's up. There's a shortage of labor. Cost of supplies and equipment was up due to inflation, now maybe going up due to tariffs and things like that, but yet reimbursement rates remain flat. So all the expenses are going up. Reimbursement remains flat. Profit margins have been really reduced, downsized, compressed. Culture is your great equalizer, to help mitigate that.
Yeah, that's right. I recently was involved in helping a couple of organizations raise debt. There's this 4 or 5 C's of credit. And as I was looking at the business model and at the risk that the bank was taking and, on these deals, I had to step back and say to myself, you know what? There needs to be another C of credit for DSOs. And specifically, it should be culture, because that culture and that ability to recruit staff, retain staff, build an organization where all of that human capital is totally engaged and bought into where this practice or where this DSO is going. I feel like we should add an extra C there, and culture should be something that's looked at when credit is looking, when somebody's looking at raising credit or one of the creditors is looking to
It is.
go in
I
that
mean,
process?
don't get me wrong. It's not listed, but you ever Ken, we've all done this, applied for a job or you try to do something or, you kind of, do a pitch or try to get somebody to hire you and you just don't get it. I mean, it's happened to all of us. Nobody gets hired, 100% of the time. And, they're all like, oh, it was great to meet you. You were good. We're just like going in another direction or, it wasn't a good fit at this time, but talk to us next time. Well, that's what the banks and people are saying. I mean, they're not going to be like, look, your culture sucked. We're afraid of you. We're leaving. Well, they'll give you one of these just not a good fit. The timing's not good. We're over our allotment of credit for the month or whatever they end up saying. But you better believe, because I represent some of these folks, that is part of their diligence and analysis. And if there is high turnover or, a lot of, unhappiness among the staff, or usually the metric they'll look at and then they'll investigate further is high turnover. If there's high turnover, they will suspect this usually happens due to poor culture and let's investigate a little more. And then the bank is thinking, well, if everybody's leaving here, the revenue of this organization is not stable or it's at risk, or what they tell me the EBITDA is might not be the EBITDA in a few months. So maybe we're going to give somebody else a loan or a credit facility and not this organization. So they're not probably ever going to come back on the denial and say, no, your culture sucks. That's why we did not. But you better believe it's part of what's going on.
That's right. And when you were talking about turnover, to be clear, you were referencing associates, or you were thinking about all of the positions that need to be filled in a dental?
All of the positions. I mean, certainly associates and dentists are something they look at, pretty first, because that's where a lot of the revenue comes from. But hygiene, a ton of revenue comes from hygiene. If you're cycling in and out of hygienists, I mean, that's not going to be a good thing. And also, if you're cycling out of even non-clinical support employees and you're constantly having to scramble, how are you going to be able to answer the phone, schedule patients, support the patients that come in the office if the non-clinical staff are never there, or you're constantly turning people over? You ever go somewhere, Ken, in any business, and it's like every time I show up at this place, I don't know if it's a gym, whatever it is, I have to repeat myself. I got to tell them the same story. They ask me the same questions. It's getting tiresome. I'm going to go to some place where they know me and I walk in and my order's all there and it's all set. Practices can be the same way. I mean, patients are somewhat forgiving, but over time, if every time they show up, it's like a new dentist, they have to re-explain their treatment plan, the recommendation that the other person made 6 months ago, now you try to explain it, the person doesn't even understand, maybe what it is. People over time are going to go elsewhere. They're going to say, I want to go where I get the same high. I mean, at least me at my practice, my personal dentist, I've had the same hygienist for years, and so if she tells me something 6 months ago or 3 months ago, we come right in and pick up where we left off. And that means it means something to me. Now, I changed hygienists every 4 or 5 years? I probably have, but that's an acceptable ratio. If you go in there and every visit there's like a new hygienist, you might just go elsewhere, and that's why, and if you think people are going to go elsewhere, if you're a bank, that means lower revenue. Patients are going to go elsewhere. We're going to lose patients, or we're going to have to spend money to acquire new patients. That cuts into the EBITDA. And maybe this isn't as creditworthy as it looks like on paper.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. All right, Brian. So it's about time to wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts before we end this episode?
Yeah, just what I always say. This is the greatest industry I've ever been a part of. I don't regret any part of the 30 years. I love being a part of this. I'm going to do this probably until they drag me out and tell me, I can't do it, anymore. So I don't want to discourage anybody from getting involved in dentistry. I just feel like everybody's got to do their homework and take the time to understand it. I think you can invest in this, even if you haven't before and been successful. You can work in a dental office if you haven't before. A new associate coming out can be successful, even though they don't know anything. But you got to take the time to understand the business of dentistry. And if you'll do that, you can be really, really successful here. And that's really what I was trying to convey.
It's amazing. I couldn't have said that anywhere near better, but I feel the same way. I've been here in dentistry since 2006, and it's been amazing. And I couldn't imagine doing anything else other than, if I was, to your point, dragged out. All right. Well, that's it for today's episode of the Dental Truth Project. Thanks again, Brian Colao, for being an amazing guest today. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to follow or subscribe. so you don't miss what's coming next. We drop an episode every Wednesday morning. I'm Ken Kaufman, and until next time, keep seeking the truth that helps dentistry thrive. Happy day.